Hello, Mr. Miskew. I'm here, Jack, to present to you my assignment 1 code. So I'll just go into PyCharm here. So I'll just explain what I thought was a challenge, what I was proud of, and just overall concepts of my code and the idea of my game and why I made it, I guess. So here's my assignment. Let me get rid of this. It's around 750 lines of code, I believe. Go right to the bottom. Yeah, so I made it a game, so I tried to base it off the Pokemon games. Obviously I didn't copy it, but I added my own characters with different unique abilities, and the idea of the game is to beat the final boss, and you warm up by facing 4 mini bosses beforehand. And I'll just go over really step by step, and I'll just go through my code here. So here are my imports, my variables outside my function for down below, and then this is where my game function begins. And here we have all my game variables, including my character variables, which I'll get onto later. Here I have a little code just to talk about the idea of my abilities and the general concept of my game. So here's the beginning of the main code, and I made this little part, this section where it's a while loop, and just so that it's accurate for the input. And I made it so that if you want, you can read through the instructions, and if you don't want, then you can just head straight to the game. And here's the introduction. I created a guy called Donald. He's like the narrator kinda, and he just talks through the game and gets it started. So he asks for your name, and then here I made use of a string manipulation, because he always says that's a hard name to pronounce, and I made it so that he eventually calls you by a harder name. That was a small joke. But here we go, and he goes through a bunch of questions. This is just response questions, it's meaningless really, but just to give it so that little breaks in between the text. And here's where I finally ask which class you want to be, and I set the variables above to be the same for each one, so it's a lot easier to code down below. And here it goes. I basically, after here, I've got 4 classes: Vampire, Werewolf, Ghost, and Zombie, all with unique different abilities and passives. And if you want, yes, you can go through your abilities, and I'll go through each one, depending on which one you want, or which one you picked. Now, this is where we hit my main function. I call it the boss function, and it's where the game really kicks off. So after all this introduction ends, and eventually you enter the dungeon, which is where all the monsters are. And I got my list here of all my variables, all my combat variables, so I could make the function, like you said, about returning individually each one, and it makes it a lot simpler to code. And basically I go through, this is probably my most pride part for the assignment is my boss function. As you can see, it's got 4 main components, each one for each character, and it means that I can just call upon this function just so that I don't have to keep remaking each boss. So here we've got basic while loops, and if bosses, for example, boss's health is set to below 0, then exits the loop. It's basic stuff. And here I've got usually there's 2 abilities, which I use an elf and an else for a character, and then the passive plays comes into play afterwards. And for each character it's unique, but the general idea kind of lies there. Anyway, so here's my boss function. I'll talk to you later about it individually, but move on to the code afterwards, where I actually have the text for each bosses. I have a little text that the bosses say, and I restate the boss variables up so that I can just get a clear picture of what the first boss is here. And also the first boss, I named it the Behemoth, and he's 38 to 10 health. And then I made it so that if there's a variable that if you die it turns false, and if you die it turns true, and if you're true then it returns the function. And here's me calling the function. And what's really cool about this function is I can keep restating these individual parts of the list so that the bosses, I can make them harder and harder, as you still see. So I've got a little bit here, which means once you beat a boss, you can upgrade your attack or defense, which is vital for beating the game. And then it moves on to the second boss, and as you can see here, I improved the attack and the health of the second boss. And basically, this part was pretty easy to code because I would just copy it and then just add 8 and 4 there, just so that it would be harder, and obviously. And I go through 4 bosses, I believe, just like the same recode, and they go up and up. And as you can see, I didn't completely add it, so I can basically see the difference between each boss. And it goes up to the 4th boss, which is Dragon, Mighty Dragon. And then eventually, through all these bosses, it goes on to the main boss. I call him the Cobb, which is my last name. And as you can see, it's quite a significant increase in both the health and the attack with this last 2 numbers here. And I finalize it. Either way, you die, but if you beat the final boss, you die as a hero. And then if you don't, then it just straight up says game over. And then here's my little while loop that I changed so that, or that I tweaked a little bit so that I could keep replaying the game if they wanted to. And I made it so that if they type in yes, then, you know, it replays the game, and if they don't, nothing happens. It obviously just replays the input. So that is my game in a nutshell. It's quite a simple game, rather. But I'll talk about my 3 proudest moments. First one obviously being the boss function right here. It took a lot of work, and actually I didn't make it into a function first, but I was able to just paste it into a function so I could keep playing it over and over again. I also am proud of how I managed to tweak this while loop so I can get the whole game running over and over again. And I guess you could also say I'm proud of just my organization of all these game variables, my combat variables, my list. And I loved how I could just tweak the combat stats of each character that the player can play, the vampire, the werewolf, ghost, and the zombie, so that it's so much easier to balance. Because my idea of a good game is a game where you can play it, you can lose, but if you know what you're doing, you win, and there's not one character that's super strong, so I could easily tweak it through this method of just organizing everything. And I'll finish off with what components I found challenging in my code. And first of things first, I'd probably say just incorporating functions, the concept of functions, and make my own function in the code. And obviously you see it in the boss function here. But at first, I didn't really know how to create the function, but eventually I learned how to, and I think through this assignment I've gathered a good understanding what a function is and how helpful it can be in a code. I also found challenging the tweaking the final while loop. I had a bit of concern because I was like, oh no, do I have to completely change my code? But turns out I just had to tweak a little bit here. And then I also found challenging probably getting the while loops done. Sometimes like I would have to change the while loops to tweak them a little bit so it would make sense. But as you can see here, where is it? One example. Here, actually I have pretty cool nifty trick I incorporated, is you can determine the speed you want the game to run at, and I state the recommended speed of both the normal game and also the combat speed, and I feel like that's good to have a difference there because obviously you want the combat to run a bit quicker, a bit more efficient so that it's not incredibly boring and long and slow. I have to say though, this game is kind of repetitive. But anyway, Mr. Miskew, this is my game really in a nutshell, and I hope you enjoyed, well, if you ran through my game playing it, and I hope you enjoyed listening to my little conversation about my game. Thank you very much.